just moving to the other end, I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Professor Paul Cooper, who is Director of the School of Education at the University of Leicester. I've known Paul for a long time. He's been very involved in ADHD, and particularly in the ADHD support group, and supporting them within the UK, has developed some really very novel educational techniques to help manage children with behavioural problems, and is going to be talking about some of those experiences and his research into them for us today. Paul.
Thanks very much, David. Well, I'm very pleased to be invited to speak at this symposium. I'll just give you my disclosures first here. I'm particularly pleased because it seems to me that one of the problems with ADHD, for once, isn't to do with the children, it is to do with the professionals. And there has been, historically, I think, something of a conflict between educational and medical perspectives on this topic. To the point that if you go to many of the sort of standard educational texts dealing with the history of education, not just in the United Kingdom and Europe, but throughout the world, there is often a chapter which has a section in it, or even a whole chapter devoted to the topic of the rejection of the medical model. And whilst we could argue that there are some very positive aspects to rejecting certain kinds of medical models, this view that's still quite widely held among educationists and educational psychologists throughout the world is something of an impediment to effective multidisciplinary cooperation in relation to this topic. So what I'm hoping to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to make a small contribution to trying to heal this discord, if you like, and perhaps move towards offer some ideas that will help us to move towards a rapprochement between educational and medical ways of thinking, which I think are absolutely central to ADHD. And in fact, I think ADHD itself could be seen as a paradigm for promoting this rapprochement. So this is what I'm hoping to do over the next few minutes, to talk about some of the ways in which school-based interventions, sometimes in combination with pharmacotherapy, can be, what sorts of interventions might be used to promote the educational progress of children with ADHD, to look at what kinds of academic environments we should be providing for children with ADHD. I mean, and this is going to be very important in relation to the kinds of things that David has just been talking about in terms of making decisions about, if you like, to put it crudely, to what extent do we need to change the child to fit the environment, or to what extent do we need to change the environment to accommodate the child. And also to look at evidence from some fairly recent and not so recent studies that have been done on the efficacy of interventions in relation to this topic. Now, the first thing I want to say, and this is something that would resonate quite comfortably, I think, with many educationists, is that approaching ADHD from an educational perspective, an informed educationist is going to immediately say that, well, actually there's something wrong with the ADHD diagnostic criteria, in the sense that it makes assumptions about what an appropriate educational environment is and what appropriate educational behaviour is for the student. We can read both the World Health Organization and the DSM diagnostic criteria as really reflecting a very conservative, frankly Victorian view of what appropriate classroom behaviour is like. The idea that children essentially should be seen and not heard, and they certainly shouldn't move around too much. I mean, if we read the diagnostic criteria in this way, as educationists, we actually are forced to come to the conclusion that many of the assumptions, the educational assumptions hidden within these criteria are questionable. In fact, the kinds of behaviours that are proscribed, if you like, implicitly in these criteria are actually behaviours that, to be suppressed are not conducive to effective learning. So a starting point, I think, for a dialogue between our different professions would be to admit that there is something of a mismatch between what schools tend to expect of young people and the characteristics that children with ADHD present. If we wanted to design a system of torture for children with ADHD, we might very well come up with something that is very much like the standard school classroom that we would recognise in almost any culture in the world as we speak. In fact, this setting that we are subjecting you to at the moment has many of the characteristics of such a system of torture. As I'm sure many of you by this stage in the proceedings are beginning to realise. But of course, this particular audience has many advantages over the average child with ADHD, that you've learnt to put up with this over many years. In fact, you probably don't have among you a terribly high level of ADHD, otherwise you wouldn't be here anyway. However, imagine that you did, and imagine how you'd be feeling at this point. So, as a starting point then to this talk, I want us to think about what it is that teachers and schools can do to make themselves more ADHD friendly. And many of the things I'm going to tell you about are things that many teachers the world over, some are doing already and many would like to be doing. The next thing, which is related to this conflict between medical and educational perspectives, is the issue of what we understand by the kind of cognitive difficulties that children present, that can be reflected in ADHD-type symptoms. Teachers the world over, I think, are quite confident and comfortable with the notion of cognitive distortions, the idea that children will misbehave in school because they have difficulties in performing the right kinds of behaviours as a result of their socialisation. So they'll have faulty ways of understanding what's going on and perhaps irrational beliefs and expectations. Well, these cognitive distortions are very common. And many emotional behaviour difficulties we experience among our pupils in schools can be understood in this way. However, there's a big difference, as many of you will realise, between a cognitive distortion and a cognitive deficit. Surface behaviour may be the same, but the underlying influences on that behaviour are very different. So a starting point for helping teachers to be able to use ADHD in a constructive way is to begin to understand the difference between a cognitive distortion and a cognitive deficit. And one of the best ways of thinking about cognitive deficits is perhaps to invoke the concept of executive function and the theories that are around about the ways in which ADHD can be understood, in part at least, as problems with executive function, problems with the very mechanisms of self-talk, behavioural synthesis, and so on. Now, once we are able to distinguish between these two concepts, then we're able to make choices about different kinds of interventions, and that's going to be quite an important theme for this talk. The next thing I think that's helpful for teachers to realise, and this is partly the result of all those years of rejecting medical models, is to try and bring our educational colleagues up to speed with the ways in which we understand biology to influence behaviour. And the simple model here that's presented initially by Frith, Jutta Frith, in relation to developmental disorders, I think is a very powerful tool for helping us to do this. But we know that there are biological, genetic origins often to problems such as ADHD. But the important thing for us to bear in mind, especially if we're trying to talk to educators about this, is the role of the mediating effect of the environment. The effect that, in fact, this is the area that, of course, teachers and parents can have the most influence over. And the ways in which the behaviour we actually see in the classroom, at home, and so on, is actually the product of an interaction between these two forces. Now, moving on very quickly, once we understand this, once we realise that educators have a significant role to play because they have an influence on the child's environment, because they have enormous access to children with ADHD during the enormous amount of time they spend with these children, it's then important then to look specifically at the kinds of effects that schools might have. Now, it's very important to acknowledge that pharmacological intervention, which has been very heavily researched, consistently shows very high effects, very significant effects on the behaviours associated with ADHD. And this is a chart taken from a meta-analysis carried out by Nicola Purdy in 2002. And as you can see, when we look at behaviour as an outcome, pharmacology is the single most effective intervention in terms of controlling these symptoms. When we look at the child's social functioning, then the multimodal approach would appear to be the most effective, though pharmacology is still pretty effective there as well. When we look though for improvements of the kind that schools and teachers are particularly concerned with, cognitive development, cognitive improvements, actually multimodal and pharmacology are less effective, it would seem, than school-based interventions. And when we look at these cognitive outcomes in more detail, we actually find that if we separate the various elements of cognitive performance, as has been measured in a number of studies, so we can separate out general cognition, which refers to problem-solving skills, the kind of skills that would be measured in IQ tests. In other words, skills that are culturally highly valued, and of course that are related to all sorts of other kinds of performance. When we look at those and we separate those out from language and mathematical kinds of performance, we find the effect of school-based interventions to be even greater. So the effect size here is 0.58, which is a very, compared to the other kinds of the other various forms of intervention that are signalled here. That's a much more effective kind of outcome that we're seeing than we are for pharmacology, non-school-based psychological interventions, and even multimodal forms of intervention. What's interesting here is the second most effective form of intervention for general cognition is parent training. Now this is really training in behaviour management, the kind of thing that Andrea Bilbo was referring to a little earlier on. So there is a very powerful argument here, I think, for getting teachers, to take a deep interest in ADHD and not to reject it as being, if you like, the medicalisation of educational problems. The existing research, and we have to say there is very limited educational research of this kind available to us, would suggest that teachers and schools have an enormous role to play in promoting the educational development of children with ADHD. Unfortunately, this study does also show, though, that there is very little that appears to be have been found anyway from the existing research to improve the language skills or the mathematical abilities of children with ADHD. That the kinds of interventions that have been that are available, that have been studied for this, are generally not terribly effective at all. Now, when we look at the kinds of interventions that schools can use and in some cases are using, then the most obvious range of interventions are psychological behavioural interventions. And these involve the manipulation of behavioural antecedents and consequences, usually through some form of reinforcement of positive behaviours, with a view to also extinguishing undesired behaviours. The kinds of reinforcement strategies that schools and teachers have available to them and use very effectively are things such as token economies, which basically mean that the use of the gathering of points which are then traded in for certain kinds of specific rewards, and the rewards that are given are things such as preferred activities, free time, food, positive attention, etc. Also, sanctions are part of this kind of intervention, such as time out and withdrawing privileges. Now, when we look for empirical support for the efficacy of behavioural interventions, one of the things that we can look at that has been widely researched over many years is the good behaviour game. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this. This first appears in a study published by Barish and colleagues in the Journal of Applied Behavioural Analysis as far back as 1969. But since then, there have been numerous studies, and I'm going to very briefly give you the sort of the bumper sticker version of what we found out from these studies. The good behaviour game, essentially, it's a contingency reinforcement strategy where pupils work in teams in a classroom situation, and they earn negative points for non-compliant behaviours. So pupils misbehave, and a check is put against their name, and at the end of the session, the team with the fewest checks against its names of members of its team will receive some kind of reward. The good behaviour game has been shown to be effective with students right from preschool right up to the age of 17 of both genders, and in mainstream and special settings. It has many variations, and the example I'm giving is just one of those variations, but this tends to be the one that occurs in the literature most and has been studied most. Educationists will often express concern about the emphasis on highlighting negative behaviour and highlighting non-compliant behaviour. But I would argue that where disinhibition is a major problem, as it is with ADHD, the highlighting of non-compliant behaviours can be very helpful in enabling the student to identify those behaviours which need to be addressed. Though it is important that it is in fact effectively positive behaviour that is being rewarded here. Now, of the 26 empirical studies that Tringstrom and colleagues reviewed in an article in 2006, this approach, the good behaviour game, was found to be extremely effective in reducing negative behaviours, particularly those associated with ADHD, such as out-of-seat behaviour, the hindering of others, inappropriate verbalisations and fidgeting. It's also effective in promoting positive behaviours, such as attention to task, improving work rate, encouraging children to speak more quietly, and pro-social behaviour and pro-social verbalisation. So, in summary, the good behaviour game effectively addresses problems of disinhibition, self-monitoring. It helps to encourage self-monitoring, compliant behaviour, attentiveness, and helps to promote social competence. There's also, moving beyond the more sort of basic behavioural approaches, there are a range of cognitive behavioural strategies that are available to teachers that are highly effective for children with ADHD. Such as self-instruction techniques, giving children protocols for helping them to deal with problem situations. And the effectiveness of these interventions tends to be enhanced when these approaches are delivered, if you like, within the school setting by teachers, rather than being delivered in clinic type settings. Partly because the efficacy of these approaches tends to be greater when there is a sort of systematically programmed approach to generalization, which basically means ensuring that there's constant reinforcement for these strategies in the school situation. So the key thing here is that CBT type strategies will help to give students control over their own learning and over their own behaviour. Now, a crucial point here, of course, is that when we look at the data on this, there is some controversy in the literature, particularly the educational literature, and it would seem to be that there are problems in the ways in which these studies are sometimes, or these interventions are sometimes designed. That if we conflate cognitive distortions with cognitive deficits, then we may be trying to reinforce the wrong kinds of behaviours. So getting that distinction right is a very important feature of effective CBT in educational interventions. Now, the other thing that I think is really important to draw attention to are the particular range of pedagogical strategies that are available to teachers, and again, which have been shown to be highly effective for children with ADHD and with a whole range of different kinds of behavioural, social, emotional behavioural problems. And I haven't really got time to go into this in any detail, but the crucial point here is, and this is something perhaps where the DSM and the World Health Organization criteria perhaps are operating in relation to an outmoded view of what pedagogy is all about. And the assumption, I would say, that's hidden within those diagnostic criteria is that pedagogy is really a process of transmission and reception. Whereas modern approaches to pedagogy are concerned with cognitive and social constructivism, which is really, in a nutshell, the idea that teaching and learning is a holistic transactional process, and it depends upon the quality of the relationship between the teacher and the student, the establishment of trust between teacher and student, and the extent to which the student feels free, to expose, in some cases, their ignorance, and in some cases, expose themselves to the risk of failure. So the notion of a supportive education environment is central to a constructivist approach. So if we take a constructivist approach, one of the things that goes with a constructivist approach is the idea that we need to understand the concept of cognitive style. And one of the ways that teachers can use ADHD effectively is to think of it as a cognitive style, a way of engaging with the world that children with ADHD have that requires to be catered for in the educational setting. So rather than inhibiting ADHD characteristics, this approach to pedagogy should exploit the ADHD characteristics as a cognitive style. And again, very briefly, some of the ways this can be done is to make use of visual motor tasks, use interactive technology, get pupils involved in active sort of sorting tasks, for example, rather than simply expecting them to engage in a kind of abstract way all of the time. Giving them kinesthetic learning opportunities, the chance to use their bodies and to actually manipulate objects as part of the learning experience. There needs to be an increased frequency of positive feedback. I mean, teachers know all about the importance of positive reinforcement, but one of the things they need to understand is that students with ADHD will require more frequent positive reinforcement if it is to be effective. Other very simple but obvious and effective remedies involve things such as getting the student with ADHD to read aloud rather than expecting them to engage in too much silent reading. And rather than expecting them not to verbalise, but to get them to verbalise in particular kinds of ways. Again, there are many variations on these, but the key point here is to utilise rather than try to extinguish the ADHD characteristics. At the whole school level, there needs to be a transparent, structured approach to routines. Attention needs to be given to ambiguity in rules and so on. That needs to be avoided. Recess deprivation, this is a crucial problem for children with ADHD, not getting access to physical activity frequently enough. There's a very good study, a series of studies by Anthony Pellegrini, which looks at this and shows how children with ADHD become much more attentive and less disruptive if they're given relatively frequent opportunities for recess spread out throughout the day. And of course, all students will tend to benefit from that kind of approach. Communication in the classroom is crucially important. Teachers need to be aware of the need for brevity in their communications and giving students access to cues to remind them to remain on task. Now, I could talk a lot more about this, but I haven't got time, so I'm going to move very quickly. Emotional literacy, giving students with ADHD the language and vocabulary for being able to talk about their emotions and their feelings and the experience of ADHD itself. There's a whole range of strategies that can be drawn on to promote this. Finally, I just want to tell you something about a particular intervention which is increasingly widespread in the United Kingdom. They're called nurture groups. These are the characteristics of a nurture group. Essentially, it's a small class with a holistic developmental curriculum. It's actually influenced very much by attachment theory in terms of its the theoretical underpinnings. Children attend a nurture group for usually between 3 and 4 terms, which is about up to 1.3 school years. And the effectiveness of nurture groups can be demonstrated through a recent study that's just about to be published. This is for children. These were children between the ages of 5 and 7, with a whole range of social, emotional, behavioural difficulties, including characteristics associated with ADHD. Basically, over a period of 2 years, we studied these groups, and we found that nurture groups are associated with significant gains in pupil performance in relation to social, emotional, behavioural difficulties and learning, and that these are generalised to mainstream settings for most children. Unfortunately, children who display hyperactive symptoms do very well in the nurture group setting, but do not tend to generalise those improvements to the mainstream. Bottom line here is that there's a great deal that mainstream teachers and classrooms can learn from nurture groups. Just very quickly, the effectiveness of nurture groups. Basically, this is over a period of 1.3 years. We studied over 300 children in nurture groups and had various comparison groups whose progress we also studied. And this is using the Goodman Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire and showing the decline in abnormal behaviour once these children were returned to the mainstream. And so what we see here is in term 1, the orange bar represents children who were in nurture groups. So they go from just under 90% of those children are scoring in the abnormal range down to around just under 70%. Children who also have social emotional behavioural difficulties of a similar nature, but were in the mainstream of in schools that had nurture groups, also improved, and that's the blue bar, though not to the same degree. Now this is interesting because when we look at children with similar characteristics who were in schools that did not have nurture groups, that's the blue bar on this graph, we saw that those children actually got worse, that their behaviour worsened over the period of study. In this case, this is over a 6-month period, whereas the left-hand bar shows you the nurture group children. So the point being is that nurture groups appear to have a whole school effect in relation to these kinds of problems. So finally, I'm hoping that I've managed to get across the view that from an educational point of view, ADHD is most usefully understood as a biopsychosocial problem. Educators have a role to play in this. And yes, ADHD often requires a multimodal treatment approach, which may involve the combination of pharmacotherapy with behavioural and cognitive and educational interventions. Students with ADHD respond very well in appropriately structured learning environments, and in fact all children will begin to develop the characteristics associated with ADHD, though to a lesser degree than the child diagnosed with ADHD, if they're exposed to inappropriate educational environments over time. And finally, behavioural interventions are highly effective for enabling educational engagement for children with ADHD. And the absence of these kinds of interventions will be associated with a decline in performance. I've done it. Thank you.